Are we living in a simulation? Blissful Gaming Paradise Podcast. Hey there, my dear friends and curious minds. Welcome back to Blissful Gaming Paradise. I'm your host, Dev, and today we're diving into a mind-bending topic that might just make you question everything you think you know about reality. Have you ever played a game so immersive that for a moment you forgot you were playing? That split second where the line between the virtual world and reality blurred. Well, what if I told you that some people believe our entire existence might be just that, an incredibly advanced simulation? That's right. Today we're exploring the fascinating and controversial idea known as the simulation hypothesis. It's a concept that's captured the imagination of philosophers, scientists, and even tech billionaires. So strap in, because we're about to embark on a journey that might just change the way you look at the world around you. In this podcast, we'll break down what the simulation hypothesis actually means, explore the arguments for and against it, and dive into the mind-bending implications of living in a simulated reality. We'll look at how advancements in technology have made this idea seem more plausible than ever, and we'll even touch on how this concept has influenced popular culture, from movies to video games. But before we dive in, I want you to take a moment and look around you. Take in the details of your surroundings, the colors, the textures, the sounds. Now ask yourself, how do you know with absolute certainty that what you're experiencing is real? It's a question that's been puzzling philosophers for centuries, and it's at the heart of what we'll be discussing today. So, let's start by breaking down what exactly we mean when we talk about the simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis explained. At its core, the simulation hypothesis proposes that our reality, everything we see, hear, feel, and experience, might be an incredibly sophisticated computer simulation. Imagine the most realistic video game you've ever played, then multiply that complexity by a factor of billions. That's the kind of simulation we're talking about. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dev, come on. That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. And you're not wrong. The idea has certainly been popularized by films like The Matrix. But here's the thing. It's not just Hollywood scriptwriters who are entertaining this idea. Some of the world's leading scientists and philosophers are taking it seriously too. To really understand the simulation hypothesis, it helps to think about it in terms of something we're all familiar with: video games. Think about how far gaming has come in just a few decades. We've gone from simple 2D sprites to vast, open worlds with near photorealistic graphics. Now, imagine where that technology might be in 100 years, or 1,000, or 1,000,000. Is it so hard to believe that at some point, we might be able to create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality? That's essentially what the simulation hypothesis proposes, that some advanced civilization, maybe even a future version of our own, has created a simulation so complex and detailed that the beings within it, that's us, can't tell that it's not real. But the roots of this idea go back much further than modern computer science. In fact, philosophers have been grappling with similar concepts for centuries. One of the most famous thought experiments in this vein is the brain in a vat scenario. Imagine your brain has been removed from your body and placed in a vat of nutrients that keeps it alive. This brain is then connected to a supercomputer that feeds it all the sensory inputs it would normally receive. In this scenario, how would you know that your experiences weren't real? How could you prove that you weren't just a brain in a vat experiencing a simulated reality? This thought experiment highlights one of the key philosophical questions at the heart of the simulation hypothesis: the nature of reality and our perception of it. It's a modern take on the age-old question: how do we know that what we perceive as reality is actually real? But it's not just philosophical ponderings that have given rise to the simulation hypothesis. Advancements in technology have played a huge role in making this idea seem more plausible than ever before. Let's think about virtual reality for a moment. Many of you have probably tried VR games or experiences. Even with current technology, these can be incredibly immersive. There are moments where you might forget that you're standing in your living room with a headset on and truly feel like you're in another world. Now, imagine that technology advancing exponentially. We're already seeing developments in haptic feedback, allowing us to feel virtual objects. There's research into direct neural interfaces that could bypass our sensory organs entirely and feed information directly into our brains. Is it so far-fetched to think that one day we might be able to create a virtual world that's indistinguishable from reality? And then there's artificial intelligence. We're making incredible strides in AI, creating systems that can learn, adapt, and even display creativity. If we can create artificial intelligences sophisticated enough, could they become self-aware? And if so, could we create entire worlds populated by these AIs? These technological advancements have taken the simulation hypothesis from the realm of pure philosophy into something that we can start to conceptualize in concrete terms. It's no longer just a thought experiment. It's become a possibility that we can imagine being realized through technology. But of course, just because we can imagine something doesn't make it true. So let's dive into some of the arguments that proponents of the simulation hypothesis use to support their case. Arguments for the simulation hypothesis. One of the most intriguing arguments for the simulation hypothesis comes from an unexpected place, the search for extraterrestrial life. You've probably heard of the Drake equation, which is used to estimate the number of civilizations in our galaxy that we might be able to communicate with. The Drake equation takes into account factors like the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the fraction of planets that could support life, and so on. One of the factors in this equation is the length of time that civilizations are able to communicate, in other words, how long they survive before either going extinct or evolving beyond our ability to detect them. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Some proponents of the simulation hypothesis argue that advanced civilizations are likely to create simulations of their own history, or even entire universes. If that's the case, then for every real universe, there could be countless simulated ones. Think about it this way. If you're playing a game like Civilization or SimCity, you might create and run multiple worlds. Now imagine a civilization millions of years more advanced than us, with computing power we can barely fathom. They could potentially create millions or even billions of simulated universes. If that's the case, then statistically speaking, it's far more likely that we're in one of the many simulations rather than the one real universe. It's a numbers game, and the numbers favor the simulation hypothesis. Another argument for the simulation hypothesis comes from the concept of the technological singularity. This is the idea that at some point in the future, artificial intelligence will surpass human intelligence, leading to rapid technological growth beyond our current ability to predict or understand. If such a singularity were to occur, it's conceivable that the resulting superintelligent AI could create simulations far beyond our current capabilities. These simulations could be so advanced that they include sentient beings who believe they are real, just as we do. Some proponents of the simulation hypothesis argue that we're likely living in an ancestor simulation, a recreation of the past created by our own descendants. The idea is that an advanced civilization might create such simulations to study their own history, or perhaps for entertainment or scientific purposes. There's also an argument based on the nature of our universe itself. Have you ever wondered why the fundamental constants of our universe, things like the strength of gravity or the speed of light, seem to be perfectly tuned to allow for the existence of life? It's a puzzle that stumped scientists for years. Some see this apparent fine-tuning as evidence for the existence of a creator. But proponents of the simulation hypothesis offer another explanation. If our reality is simulated, then of course the parameters would be set to allow for our existence. Just as a game designer creates a world with rules that allow for gameplay, the creators of our simulation would have set the parameters to allow for the emergence of life and consciousness. There are also those who point to apparent anomalies or glitches in our reality as evidence for the simulation hypothesis. Things like déjà vu or the Mandela effect, where large groups of people seem to share false memories, are sometimes cited as potential glitches in the simulation. Of course, these arguments are far from conclusive. For every person who sees these as evidence for the simulation hypothesis, there are others who have different explanations. But they do highlight how this idea has moved from pure philosophy to something that people are actively looking for evidence to support or refute. Arguments against the simulation hypothesis. Now, as compelling as some of these arguments might sound, the simulation hypothesis is far from universally accepted. There are plenty of scientists, philosophers, and thinkers who have strong arguments against it. Let's take a look at some of these counterarguments. One of the most obvious objections to the simulation hypothesis is based on the limitations of our current technology. Creating a simulation as complex as our perceived reality would require computing power far, far beyond what we currently possess. Think about it. To simulate every atom in the universe, every interaction between particles, every thought in every mind, the computational requirements would be staggering. Some argue that it's simply not possible, even for a highly advanced civilization, to create a simulation of an entire universe with the level of detail we experience. There's also the question of energy requirements. Running such a vast and complex simulation would require enormous amounts of energy. Some argue that the energy required would be more than is available in an entire universe. Of course, proponents of the simulation hypothesis might counter that the laws of physics in the base reality might be different from what we experience, allowing for such simulations to be possible. Another major argument against the simulation hypothesis revolves around the nature of consciousness and free will. We still don't fully understand how consciousness arises from the physical structures of our brains. Some argue that creating truly conscious beings within a simulation might be impossible, as consciousness might be an emergent property that can't be replicated in a simulated environment. There's also the question of free will. If we're in a simulation, are our actions predetermined by the program? Do we have genuine free will, or are we simply following a script? These are deep philosophical questions that don't have easy answers, but they do pose challenges to the simulation hypothesis. Some critics also point out that the simulation hypothesis is, in many ways, unfalsifiable. That means there's no way to conclusively prove or disprove it. In science, unfalsifiable hypotheses are generally viewed with skepticism. If there's no way to test whether we're in a simulation or not, some argue, then it's not a particularly useful hypothesis. There's also an argument against the simulation hypothesis based on Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Is it simpler to assume that our reality is exactly what it appears to be, or that it's an incredibly complex simulation created by an advanced civilization? Some would argue that the former is the simpler, and therefore more likely explanation. Another interesting counterargument comes from the field of information theory. Some scientists argue that to perfectly simulate our universe would require a computer at least as complex as the universe itself. If that's the case, then there would be no advantage to running such a simulation. You might as well just have the real thing. And then there's the anthropic principle, which states that any valid theory of the universe must be consistent with our existence as conscious beings. Some use this principle to argue against the simulation hypothesis. They say that the fact that we exist and are able to contemplate our existence is evidence that our reality is, in fact, real. Implications and influence. Whether you find the arguments for or against the simulation hypothesis more convincing, there's no denying that this idea has had a significant impact on both scientific thought and popular culture. In the realm of science and philosophy, the simulation hypothesis has sparked new ways of thinking about the nature of reality, consciousness, and even the purpose of existence. It's led to interesting thought experiments and has influenced fields ranging from cosmology to computer science. For example, some scientists have proposed potential ways to test the simulation hypothesis. One idea suggests looking for evidence of rounding errors in the laws of physics, which might indicate that our reality is running on a finite computing system. Another proposes searching for patterns in cosmic rays that might be evidence of the underlying structure of a simulated universe. While these proposed tests are largely theoretical and may not be feasible with our current technology, they demonstrate how the simulation hypothesis is pushing the boundaries of scientific inquiry. The idea has also had a profound influence on popular culture. We've already mentioned The Matrix, but that's far from the only example. Movies like Inception, The 13th Floor, and Ready Player One all play with ideas of simulated realities. In literature, authors like Philip K. Dick were exploring these concepts long before modern computers made them seem plausible. And of course, in the world of video games, the idea of simulated realities is a recurring theme. Games like The Sims let players create and control simulated worlds, while others like Assassin's Creed play with the idea of experiencing simulated historical periods. These cultural explorations of simulated realities do more than just entertain. They encourage us to question our assumptions about reality and consider the nature of our existence. They are modern versions of age-old philosophical questions, presented in ways that resonate with contemporary audiences. The simulation hypothesis has also sparked ethical debates. If we accept the possibility that we might be living in a simulation, does that change how we should live our lives? Does it affect the meaning or value of our experiences? These are profound questions that philosophers and ethicists are grappling with. Some argue that if we're in a simulation, then nothing we do really matters. It's all just data in a computer program. Others counter that even if we are in a simulation, our experiences and choices are still real to us and therefore have meaning and importance. There's also the question of how we should treat simulated beings if we ever create them ourselves. If we develop the ability to create conscious beings in a simulated environment, what moral obligations would we have to them? It's not just a hypothetical question. As AI becomes more advanced, we're already starting to grapple with questions about the rights and ethical treatment of artificial intelligences. As we wrap up our exploration of the simulation hypothesis, I hope you're left with a sense of wonder at the complexity and mystery of our existence. Whether you find the idea convincing or not, it's a fascinating thought experiment that challenges us to question our assumptions about reality. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explained what the simulation hypothesis is and where it came from. We've looked at the technological advancements that have made it seem more plausible, and we've explored arguments both for and against the idea. We've also touched on its impact on science, philosophy, and popular culture. So where does this leave us? Are we living in a simulation? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know for certain. But in many ways, that's not the point. The value of the simulation hypothesis isn't in whether it's ultimately proven true or false, but in the questions it prompts us to ask. It challenges us to think deeply about the nature of reality, consciousness, and our place in the universe. It pushes the boundaries of our scientific understanding and sparks new avenues of research. And it reminds us that there's still so much we don't understand about our existence. Whether our reality is base reality or a simulation, one thing is certain: our experiences, our choices, our relationships, they all feel real to us. And in that sense, perhaps it doesn't matter whether we're in a simulation or not. What matters is how we choose to live our lives, how we treat others, and the impact we have on the world around us, simulated or not. As we go forward, I encourage you to keep an open and curious mind. Question your assumptions, explore new ideas, and never stop wondering about the nature of our reality. After all, that curiosity, that drive to understand our existence, is one of the things that makes us human, whether we're biological entities or lines of code in a cosmic computer program. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What do you think about the simulation hypothesis? Does it seem plausible to you, or do you think it's just science fiction? How would you feel if you found out we were living in a simulation? Share your thoughts in the comments or reach out on social media. I'd love to keep this conversation going. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the simulation hypothesis, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast. Next week, we'll be back to our regular gaming content. But let me know if you'd like to see more episodes exploring the intersection of gaming, science, and philosophy. This is Dev from Blissful Gaming Paradise, signing off. Remember, whether this reality is simulated or not, it's up to us to make it a meaningful and enjoyable experience. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.